Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kyle from Business Review, an NS Media company, and I'll be your host today. It's our pleasure to have Lumis Life Science Consulting with us, who is presenting this webinar entitled Effective Vendor Management. Today's guest speakers are Heike Schön, Managing Director, and Dr. Christiane Juhls, Project Director. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click the link you received via email to rejoin the session. If you want to ask any questions, you can send those in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top right-hand corner of your screen, click Submit, and we'll have some time at the very end to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But for now, please welcome Heike Schön. Over to you, Heike.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kyle. Also from me, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and hello, wherever you are. And very welcome to our webinar on effective vendor management, and thank you so much for joining. This webinar is organized by Lumis Life Science Consulting. Lumis Life Science Consulting is specialized in supporting biopharmaceutical and medical device companies during their outsourcing procedures, vendor management, contracting, and also trial oversight management. My name is Heike Schön, and I'm the managing director of this company. And from my background, I have worked for more than 25 years with small, medium, and large CROs, as well as in biotechnology. And with this, with me, today I have Christiane. So Christiane, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Heike. My name is Christiane Juhls, as was just mentioned, and also from me, a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening to everyone. I'm the project director at Lumis Life Science Consulting, and I warmly welcome you to our webinar as well. And with that, I would like to hand back to Heike.
Okay, thank you. Before we start going into the topic, I have some little organizational remarks. You will receive a presentation for the next 45 minutes, which will be followed by a question and answer session, as Kyle has introduced you. And during the webinar, we have prepared 2 polls, which we would like to ask you and to get your answers on this. And we will share the results immediately after. So I will move now to the agenda. So what will be the topics today? We will talk generally about outsourcing, how to select the most suitable vendor, and we'll cover a large proportion on risk-based vendor management, followed by oversight management, and summarizing at the end, followed by a question and answer session for your questions to be answered. So then, we thought when we start talking about outsourcing, it would be really good to look at the definition. What is outsourcing? We found a definition by the Cambridge Dictionary, which I think is quite suitable to my understanding. And it says outsourcing is the use by one company of another business to do particular tasks because it can do them more effectively or cheaply. So companies can increase profits through strategic outsourcing. And what does it mean now in the combination with clinical research activities? So here's a translation. The sponsor can leverage the clinical research organization's therapeutic area and operational expertise, geographic reach, and well-established processes and tools. And throughout the webinar, we will talk how this can be managed most effectively. But we also would like to mention at the beginning, outsourcing can definitely increase the complexity of your projects, which should not be underestimated. Another general remark at that stage, we are using throughout the webinar the term vendor, and this summarizes all potential vendors, CROs, CMOs. But just to make it sure we are talking about outsourcing to service organizations, we use the term vendor. So what is the concept of outsourcing? It's an old concept. It's nothing really new to the industry. And here I would like to reference W.C. Benton. He wrote an interesting book in 2009 about purchasing and supply management, which was completely industry independent. But the processes and the assumptions are quite comparable also to our industry. He basically divides it in two parts. One is evaluating the business case when you want to outsource, and the other one, of course, is the implementation and management and what has to be considered. It starts with the strategic outsourcing. At that stage, the company definitely should make a decision whether they make it by themselves or whether they outsource. The activity to outsource should be of strategic importance. So, for example, if you're a small company, you outsource your clinical trial most 80% because you do not have the resources. On the other hand, it's also very important to evaluate the risks when you are outsourcing. And the second part for the strategic is the financial evaluation. Does it make, in the short and long term, financially sense to outsource? And what are the costs of outsourcing? This is sometimes quite underestimated because there are some hidden costs to outsourcing. You have increased travel activities for kickoff meetings, evaluating of vendors. Within the company's departments might get much more work than they had before. For example, in small companies, suddenly invoices come in to the finance department, which is much more work, or to the legal department. So these things have to be carefully considered when you want to become ready to outsource. The other part is a supplier selection and contract development. We will go into these points later in more detail. And then after you have selected your supplier or your vendor, there is a transition to the external sourcing model. So that means you have to have a governance in place, you have to agree on communication, procedures, tools, and also within the sponsor company, the team has to be ready to work with external suppliers to give up maybe some work they did before on their own, and really to translate to the teams, to train the vendors, and to go really into a full transition. And the one key important part is, of course, the relationship management. This starts already with the selection process, but the relationship develops throughout the whole process and will be an important part until, the contract is finalized and over and worked out. Sorry. Okay. So this is the concept of outsourcing. And then there was a question, why do companies outsource? And there is a survey which was performed by Contract Pharma in 2018, and they asked more than 200 sponsor companies at different sizes and in different therapeutic indications. And the majority of these companies mentioned that they outsource because they want to focus on core competencies. So 34% wanted to focus on core competencies, to streamline their internal procedures and to add the necessary knowledge and resources. And the second main point was mentioned that the company is virtual, which in this case means that these were more small companies who had not the necessary resources and wanted to cover all the activities through outsourcing. With this, we get to our first poll. And, oh no, this is, the poll is covering what are the main challenges of outsourcing. So please answer this question from your perspective. We have prepared some answers from our experience, which is aligning objectives, quality issues, keeping timelines, unexpected budget changes, frequent change of team members at the vendor. So please submit your answer. Okay, so here we have the answers. So the majority of you mentioned aligning objectives and expectations between sponsor and vendors, and this is a very interesting answer, and we will definitely cover these issues throughout our presentation, as this is a very important part to align, to be transparent, and to make clear expectations between sponsor and vendors. And the second one is keeping timelines and quality issues. Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting to get your feedback. Let's continue. And we also used another survey which asked sponsors what are their main challenges of outsourcing, and which is a little bit in line with what you have answered. It's communication and cultural issues, documentation, and the vendor qualification and selection. But we are not only interested in what the sponsors answering, so we also look at what are the key challenges for providers. They had a chance to select their top 3 challenges, and the majority of the vendors answered that unrealistic deadlines was for them a key issue, a key challenge, and insufficient information, which brings us back also to your answer about aligning objectives and expectations. So this is generally covering the topic of outsourcing. We will move now into how best select the partner, the right partner to work with. And for us, it is comparable to dancing. And for those of you who dance, or might even dance tango, you might understand that to tango, to dance together, it needs a lot of trust and a relationship development over time. The better the trust, the closer the relationship, the better are the moves and the harmony in dancing. So, but before we look at these details, we will look into what type of relationships are possible to dance with. Here we have niche providers, a different type of vendors. We have the niche providers. They provide limited services, can be in a special therapeutic area or geographic region, and it can be a special service area, like, for example, more and more the companies offering flying study nurse services or site payment organizations. As another possible relationship, we have the full service, where in this case, a sponsor contracts with one main vendor to perform the majority of all tasks. It can be across different functions, geographical regions, but it's mainly for one clinical trial. A third relationship possibility is a functional services. So this is when a provider gives a service which is related to a certain function, like monitoring or data management. Generally, these functions then are not available at that time with the sponsor team. And the fourth example of a relationship is the alliance, the strategic alliance. This is when a sponsor outsources all projects of a portfolio to a selected vendor. This is a long-term work, it's guaranteed work for the vendors, and it's a strategic partnership because the vendors are involved at early stages of planning, they are part of scientific boards, and generally they are also without competition. So as we talk about the best way to select, we have provided you here with an example which can be seen as a standardized process to select vendors. And generally it starts with the outsourcing strategy, as we mentioned at the beginning. Understand why you outsource, define your needs, your budget, your timelines. We would always recommend to have this in an interdisciplinary outsourcing team. They should manage the whole process. It should be part of clinical, legal, quality department, and finance department, as an example. You might not always know which vendors would suit best for your question, for your clinical trial. So we would recommend to go for a request for information from vendors, get back their experience, see whether they could fit for your purpose, and so that you can perform a pre-evaluation of the information, which then could lead to a more detailed request for proposal. The request for proposal should always cover a lot of information for the CRO. We would recommend to have a standard bid grid to ensure that you can compare the costs, that you can compare the proposals, that they always calculate the same task. Provide them with the study information, and if best would be also roles and responsibilities. Be transparent on the selection process and the timelines until when you want to go for a final decision. You want to know more the vendors you are talking to, so it's good to have these so-called bid defense meeting or vendor selection meetings. Here it is quite important that the project team is present, the future project team from the vendor to work together with the CRO. And we always recommend you should really take some time for both sides to socialize also during these bid defense meetings, because it's a long-term relationship you are starting to build. And after the bid defense meeting, the teams from the sponsor should perform a vendor assessment, also with, if possible, a standardized vendor assessment. You will start with the contract negotiation team and moving into an operational kickoff meeting. This is a part of the evaluation and contract management, and which can be, of course, also quite extensive, especially when it comes to the contract management. But we will talk about this also a little bit later. So what are the common challenges during the selection process? As you see, it's quite standard. It can be quite standardized, but it needs also a lot of work to be prepared. Therefore, it can be easily underestimated the time and resources needed to select the right vendor. You have to have standardized tools, you have to have a team in place, and this is on top of their work. The challenges also which are coming from this vendor say that the sponsor sometimes do not communicate clear expectations. So the vendor is always a little bit in the assumption what could be the best approach. So I think it's good always to tell your expectations. If the processes of the request for information or request for proposal are not standardized, it can lead to an ineffective comparison of services and cost. It can start also a renegotiation due to important feasibility results. Then the selection process is even extended, so you have to adjust timelines, but in a positive way, because the more you know about potential outcome of your clinical trial, the better. Avoid unrealistic timelines. They might have a huge impact later on cost and resources. The decision-making process is always a challenge. We will recommend to use scoring tools so that you have a more neutral way of scoring the vendor. And then, of course, the contract negotiation. This is resource and time intensive and should be prepared accordingly. So when you have selected the vendors, there are different ways to assess your vendors. One is already during the outsourcing process, during the selection process, where you go for the therapeutic experience, what is the past and current experience of the vendor for ongoing study. Do they have ongoing studies in your indication, in your therapeutic area? Do they have well-established contacts to key opinion leaders in different countries and with different sites? As part of the evaluation process, we always recommend to perform a qualification audit at the vendor to get familiar with their quality management system, how they train their staff, how the reporting processes are, and compare these processes and activities also to the SOPs. The skill set of the team members is quite important because you want to make sure that you have the real needed skills for your clinical trial. So it's the therapeutic and the work experience of the individuals, how they are trained and on what they are trained. And another important aspect is, are they involved in other ongoing studies? And last not least, you never want to change the vendor in the middle because they get bankrupt. So do also a financial assessment on their stability. review the annual reports, look at their staff turnover, and also at the structure of the senior management, whether this has changed a lot over the time. So I also would like shortly to jump onto contract negotiation. Here it's always a question whether you have your own template as a sponsor or whether you use a vendor template. We would always recommend that a sponsor should have its own template. Part of the contract should be roles and responsibilities, the timelines and milestone payments. Don't pay on just percentage, but on success to reach certain milestones during the process of the study. Another topic to be discussed always is bonus malus versus bonus only. We personally are not very fond of bonus malus, but of a good bonus payment if the vendor provides results much earlier than originally planned. This is a bonus for the sponsor and for the vendor. In case they don't deliver in time, they have already a malus because they will not get paid until they have reached the milestone. So another part of the contract should be the governance charter. We will talk later about the content of a governance charter and a quality agreement. This should be easily be done. And overall, generally, I would say, please be very precise in the contract, but keep a very cooperated mindset. Yeah, here is an example for the governance charter, which has different layers. One is the project management. The project team is the operational team. They do the day-to-day project planning and reporting. Then on top of that is the operational management team, which has mainly senior managers, line managers from sponsor and vendors. They are there to set realistic goals, monitor key performance indicators and adherence to contract. And then the third part of the governance charter is the executive steering committee, which is a team of the senior executives from both parties. And this is also very important that they should regularly meet to share their experience, whether the study is running smooth, whether they have any problems. And it's a very important level also to build trust and to commit to each other. And that has a high impact if the sponsor is satisfied, and the vendor might get even more work with the sponsor. So these are the different layers of a governance charter. And within the governance charter, you will define the reporting system, the communication system, the regular updates between these three levels. To create the governance, and also what I mentioned at the beginning, the importance of the relationship management, I would also like to make you familiar with the concept of different layers in the relationship management. It starts with the behavioral foundation. That's the basic layer where the sponsor and the vendor should commit to each other, cooperate, and define the expectations, and to start generating trust. Then the relationship governance is the second level, where you start the cultural adaptation to understand each other's organization, decision-making points, create a shared vision between the sponsor and the vendor team, and continuously work on the team building. And then we have the third layer, which is the contractual governance, as we have just looked at. These are the definition of the services, the finances, the milestones. So these are more the factual one compared to the soft skill development on the two other layers. So with this, I have covered our outsourcing activities to find the best partner. And I would like now to hand over to Christiane to cover the risk-based vendor management.
Thank you, Heike. And in this section now, we will talk about the risk-based vendor management. And talking about risk means we first have to look at what risks can occur in clinical trials. There is a nice definition given in the ICH guideline, Q9. And that says that risks are events that are characterized by the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. And throughout the study, these risks vary. since they are depending on multiple factors and these might change. For example, factors are the clinical research process itself, the study design, the preparation you have done, but also they are depending on persons and individuals like stakeholders, subjects, investigators, and others. And the consequence is that throughout this study, you have to continuously identify and manage your risks. It is important to remember that there are also risks on both sides. And that means that the sponsor has risks that are related to the vendor, while the vendor has risks that are related to the sponsor's company. For example, the sponsor may be confronted with a greater workload and more financial resources required than he initially planned. He may also lose oversight at a certain point, and this webinar will be also about how not to lose oversight. And another risk to the sponsor is that the vendor company undergoes a major change. That might be related to merger and acquisition. The vendor, on the other hand, faces sponsor-related risks or may face them. That means especially if you have a small sponsor company with limited clinical experience, it might be more difficult to implement the study synopsis and also to conduct the study. If the sponsor faces budget constraints, this may be another risk to the vendor. And also a sponsor company may undergo a major change related to merger and acquisition. So in consequence, each partner should identify, assess and manage its own risks, and ideally appoints specifically for that a risk manager and gives that manager a good team. Risks compromising potentially the efficient delivery of your clinical trial have to be jointly assessed by the sponsor and the provider. And here, the points to consider are directly related to the study. So the indication that you are working with or in is crucial, the country of the study sites, as well as the clinical phase, or logistics, supply issues, and others. And a few examples of such risks are also listed on the right-hand side of the slide, and they are related, for example, to an inadequate study design, or a limited shelf life of the study medication, or at the end of the study, you may see that the data were not captured properly. Actually, you should see it in between by monitoring, but some people also only see it in the end. So risk management may be viewed as it is shown in this picture. You may be juggling your risks while not having a solid ground underneath your feet. But what we propose is to have a different view on the risk management. It's actually about building a parachute so that you can smoothly land whatever the risk is that you are facing during the clinical trial. And that leads us to the general risk management process. This process starts with identifying the risk. So ask yourself what might go wrong, and then assessing those risks by looking at the likelihood of their occurrence and the impact they may have on your study. And that means the quality, the time, and the budget. And ultimately, of course, the patient safety and the data integrity. Once you have assessed your risks, you need to control and mitigate them, communicate them, review them regularly, and then, importantly, also report them. So that at the end of the study, you can show that you have managed the risk successfully, recorded them, and also interpreted their impact on the trial quality correctly. And this is part of being ready for inspection by the authorities. Risk assessment and management throughout the study starts with looking at the impact and the likelihood of the occurrence, as I mentioned before. And this assessment should be done by an interdisciplinary team. and it should involve the vendor. For assessing the risk, it's best to use a risk matrix, be as simple as possible. It doesn't need to be as simple as it is here on the picture. You may also have a ranking list based on numbers or on factors. But in the end, you should end up with a ranking list of risks and having the critical and the high lists in top of the list or on top of the list, while listing medium and low risks only in the not so important part of your list. But don't forget about them. So while focusing in the trial always on the critical and high risks, don't forget about the others, because they may change. And that is the reason why you should continuously monitor and evaluate them, as I said before. However, the critical and the high risks are those that will have a big influence on the quality, time, and budget of your trial, and therefore you need to mitigate these risks at first hand. And that means to reduce the likelihood of their occurrence and or their impact. And to say it in simple words, it means if I see a risk coming or it's already happening, what will I do and at which point? That helps you to stay in control of your clinical trial and also of your vendor performance. And to be able to recognize those risks and also to forecast them, it's recommended to apply metrics and key performance indicators. Metrics in this context are single measures, and they should be always relevant. They should be actionable, accessible, and accurate. You will end up with a long list of metrics because there is a lot that can be measured, but be sure that you select only the important ones, and of those, select the critical, consolidate them, and turn them into key performance indicators. Key performance indicators are the critical metrics. They are high level, and they help you to assess the vendor's performance, but also your own performance against your objectives. And in consequence, before you even can do something about the key performance indicators, have your objectives defined precisely and in a good way. Here are a few examples on how to turn metrics into key performance indicators. First, you have a risk identified. That is, in this case, that your study may start with delay. The related metric is the cycle time from regulatory approval to site activation, and the key performance indicator is the maximum time, the maximum number of days you allow for this cycle time. Because this has a big impact on the patient recruitment and also on the milestone, usually it is one, first patient in, and also it has an impact on the enrollment of forecast. And here you might mitigate this risk by reviewing your site activation plan and doing a very thorough root cause analysis. In the next slide, we have listed for you some of the most frequently used KPIs for vendor performance as given by the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. And most often mentioned KPIs are listed on top of the graphic or in the upper part, and all of them are related to time. So it's about study startup, enrollment, and last patient, last visit to database lock. Now I lost. Okay, so with that, I would like to summarize the risk-based vendor management section. And I hope we could show you how important it is to identify and assess the study-related risks with all stakeholders right jointly at the project start, and to manage the risks throughout the study to stay in control. And to do that, you monitor regularly and jointly the metrics and the key performance indicators. Doing that, please focus on a core manageable set of KPIs in order to predict and assess the achievement of your goals and your vendor. While reviewing the KPIs regularly, do it again together with the vendor. It's part of the good communication, as mentioned by Heike previously, and also something you can do when you have established a good trust. And related to that is the ensurement that the information is flying from the source to the recipient. So most information should be agreed upon in front of the study start on how and when and to whom they will be provided so that you can look at your key performance indicators. Always apply a simplified way of reviewing your data. For example, use dashboards and create a possibility for an effective high-level overview. This helps not only your upper management, it also helps you if you want to have oversight. And getting back to metrics, we would like to remember you that just because you can measure it, it doesn't mean you should. And it's another reference to keep it simple, keep it efficient, and work together smoothly. And with that, I would like to hand over to Heike again to introduce you to our second poll.
Yeah, here's the second poll for you to hopefully answer. So the question is, what is the top challenge of your sponsor-vendor relationship? And potential answers could be differences in company cultures, frequent change of team members, lack of transparency in communication, understanding decision-making processes at partners' company, timely transmission of critical information. Okay, thank you very much. So the main feedback covers the lack of transparency in communication and responsibilities. I think this is very interesting and very important, as we had covered a couple of these issues before, how important it is to establish a good communication, for example, through a governance charter, and to clearly define roles and responsibilities. So I hope we could have given you some input for this challenge. We come now to the last topic of our webinar today. It's about oversight management. Oversight management for us can be seen as a conductor of an orchestra. You have a lot of different people, instruments, ideas from different, in our case, from different vendors, and all these different goals, challenges have to come together to create a harmony and therefore to have a successful conduct of a clinical program, of a clinical trial. So as a conductor, you have also to be very familiar with the guidelines and the regulations. Here it's a short excerpt, so what is really needed, bringing us back to the beginning, saying a sponsor can outsource and delegate all parts of the clinical trial, but you always have to be aware that it's a final responsibility of the sponsor to ensure patient safety and data integrity. And this is also defined and supported by various guidelines and directives, which of the main importance one is the ICH GCP guideline E6 in its revision, where they have defined more clearly what the expectations of sponsors in their oversight management are. So therefore, a sponsor has to implement a proper oversight to minimize the risk and to implement a risk-based quality system. This all should lead to inspection readiness at any time. Oversight management is, on the one hand, the measurement of performance management, and on the other, the relationship management. So for the performance management, you will implement systems for project management and controlling, contract management, the adherence to contract timelines and budgets, the quality of the clinical services, and also, of course, the timeline of the clinical services, and the information and transparency can be measured during the performance of the clinical trial. It should be laid down in specific oversight plans, which then contain also the type of measurements. The other part is the relationship management, which is a little bit more difficult to measure, but you will live it. It starts during the sourcing or outsourcing strategy and vendor planning. It goes throughout the vendor selection and integration, where you develop more and more further the relationship and trust. Throughout the time, you should optimize the vendor relationship if everything also to make everything work well. And very important, and this you have confirmed in the last poll also, is a proactive communication. How to do this is, as suggested already, the sponsor vendor governance structure with a definition how you need to escalate risk and to implement communication. So oversight, from our experience, is a lot of tracking. So sometimes I call companies the Excel companies because they track a lot of activities. And here we have also to be very careful. There's a tendency of sponsors to track activities, but I think it's sometimes also a duplication of the effort, because you can get the majority of the data from the vendor. They have the system, they have their clinical trial management system, their data management system, so they can generate the data you would need. So it's easier for you to define what you need and the analysis with it than tracking it yourself, because you would duplicate the efforts, and this should be for sure avoided. So the risk-based oversight management, we talked about risks just now. What are the challenges for sponsors? The main challenges is really to avoid duplication and to get the oversight data directly from the vendors. So discuss with them what you need. They will tell you for sure what they can deliver or what they need to adjust. It is very important that you jointly define with the vendors the risk and triggers throughout a clinical project. And again, for the sponsor, create a balanced oversight and prevent micromanagement. So hardly use your own Excel sheets. Be transparent with the vendors about your findings, about your maybe additional analysis, agree on an action plan, perform a root cause analysis, and define a CAPA, how you can prevent the reoccurrence of these kind of findings. And define a clear escalation procedure, like in the governance charter, and use the escalation procedure. Reflect regularly where you stand and where your risk oversight management is performed. What are the success factors for oversight management? For our understanding, it is more to create a partnership model rather than an oversight framework. Focus on enabling trust, emphasize the importance of open communication and transparency. Agree on the governance charter and to establish the basis of the relationship with a lean structure, clear roles and responsibilities, and mutual agreement on metrics. Proactively define challenges and pitfalls and create your risk registry and the mitigation strategies. And jointly review progress and work collaboratively on the challenges. So now I hand back to Christiane to summarize our key takeaways.
And time and budget. And also be aware that your company and your departments that are involved in the outsourcing process may undergo a transition. Very early and before contacting any vendor, define your own goals very precisely and lay down your expectations as good as you can. And then standardize the selection process by developing tools to select the most suitable vendor. Once you have contacted and selected or pre-selected the vendors, agree on roles and responsibilities. And don't forget yourself. Also, your roles and responsibilities need to be fixed and agreed upon with the vendor, and this should be part of your contract. Then develop an effective business relationship. Heike has explained a lot of that, and it really adds on and will be also financially measurable in the end. Because you save time and you save a lot of effort when your business relationship is a healthy and good one. And then it must be based on trust and a shared vision of success. Another key takeaway is that we propose to identify and assess the risks to the project jointly, and that prevents misunderstandings and also different views. And once you have identified and assessed those risks, manage them throughout the entire study and communicate them between you and the vendor. Develop together with the vendor the relevant metrics and key performance indicators and implement them right at the beginning. And ensure throughout the entire study the efficient flow of information while avoiding the duplicate vendors' work, as Heike said. And of course, it's important to keep oversight of the vendor's performance, and that's why you have the option to study and to monitor the progress by using key performance indicators. And those enable you timely to take corrective and preventive actions, and you do that according to a risk management plan. And then, last but not least, integrate, that's our recommendation, governance models through oversight plans to ensure a success of your entire project, and your success is also the success of the vendor, and be the conductor of your clinical trial. And with that, I would like to move you to the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now time for the Q&A. So a quick reminder on this, if you want to take part, just type your question into the box in the top right-hand corner of your screen, click submit, and then wait to hear if your question is read out now. Well, you've had quite a few come in over the course of the webinar, so we can just get started. So our first question is, where can I find suggestions for key performance indicators?
Yeah, there are different sources possible. Of course, there is this metrics consortium which regularly works on optimizing KPIs, and you always can contact us. We have a lot of ideas on KPIs. So, but I think it's really important if you talk also to your colleagues, to other companies, to get an idea what key performance indicators would make sense for your special purpose.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I got another question here asking, how many key performance indicators should I implement per project?
Yeah, actually, this depends, of course, on the type and size of project. But for example, I would avoid to have more than 15 KPIs. I think it's more important really to focus on the most important KPIs, which have the highest impact. But that should definitely not be more than 15.
Okay, very good. I've got a question asking, what main factors should I consider when choosing a vendor?
Yeah, thank you for this. I think it's also depends on your needs. What should the vendor really perform? What kind of services do you need from the vendor? Is that a therapeutic area? Is it a geographic area? And this is one part, but then I think it's also very important to get to know the team of the vendor. And because here, this is something very important. You have to work over the next months, years, together on a project. And therefore, it is really good to understand the team, the social background, the training, and their experience for your type of clinical trial.
Okay, thank you. Someone who has written in, can we customize key performance indicators based on trial, or is it standard to follow? Or it's standard to follow, sorry.
I would recommend to customize them. There are, of course, you have some standards, how you want to measure site quality, how you want to measure certain timelines adherence. They can be standardized, but then you always have different needs in the clinical trial, so that they should be also customized. It's a combination.
Okay, thank you. How can you keep trust to the CRO when timelines are extended and budget continues to increase all along the study?
Well, let's start with a root cause analysis. What has changed? Why it was not communicated early enough? And define action plans. Try to avoid that the relationship gets worse. You can even use a mediator to talk to both sides. But I think it's very important that you both parties should talk to each other, go for the root cause analysis and find the best solution out of it. Because the CRO does not want to extend the timelines and the sponsor definitely also not. So there should be solutions to it.
Okay, cool. I've got a question asked, just saying, many times vendors ask for upfront payment to launch services. What should I accept?
Yeah, this is always a difficult question. I think it is justifiable that the vendor asks for some upfront payment because they should not go cash negative already at the beginning. But I think you should always look what activities are covered through this upfront payment, and it should be in relation to what they have calculated. For example, if the next payment after the upfront payment is at first patient in, they will have covered a lot of activities until then. So but you can keep the upfront payment small, but then have a little bit more payments related to certain success factors like submission of clinical trial application, of finalization of the database, things like that, so that you can keep the upfront payment low.
Okay, thank you. How long does it take to select a CRO properly?
Yeah, it also depends on the size of the study, of course, and whether you have, like, let's say for an orphan drug, you might need a little bit longer because there are only few providers. But generally, I would estimate it should be between 3 and 6 months to make final decision. Sometimes, because it can be done in 3 months, but for example, sometimes assumptions change due to feasibility results, and then you go back and you recalculate again and you discuss again. So allow for 6 months to be on the safe side.
Okay, very nice. Someone here is asking for a recommendation on how best to maintain oversight of vendor staff training compliance, such as both organizations working from a common set of SOPs.
Yes, if I understand it correctly, that would mean that you should have information about the training, the regular retraining, and also training on new topics. And this is something which can be done also together with vendor and sponsor to make sure that the team is always on top of regulatory expectations, of indications, therapeutic knowledge. So this can be done together, but it should also be reviewed in the SOP of the vendor, how often they retrain their staff and on new topics.
Okay, thank you. Someone here is asking, how many people do I need at the sponsor to perform oversight management per project?
Oh yes, this is also a very good question. Yeah, there is a little rule of thumb, but unfortunately I cannot reference in the literature. It's more due to experience also with discussion of other sponsors and vendors. If you have around 6 to 8 people at the vendor side working on your project, for each 6 to 8 people working on the vendor side, you should have one function internally to perform oversight. So now, depending on the size of the project, like whether it's a phase 1 or phase 3, you might have a smaller or larger team to perform oversight.
Okay, thank you. We've got someone writing in saying, to establish a presented governance charter with all teams and levels can be quite challenging for small or inexperienced companies. what is the best approach in such case? And where can one get more information / help on this topic?
Well, the governance charter should generally be created together with a vendor. And they will also have experience in these governance charters. And so they could provide you with a template if necessary so that you can walk through and agree on all the different levels. It is definitely a challenge to start from scratch, but there are also consultants available, consulting companies to help you on this. But first talk to your vendor and find out whether they can provide input which you can review and adjust to your needs. If you have not much experience, let's say from the sponsor side, I would always recommend to have some professional support at that stage.
Okay. How much importance we should give to supply chain management?
This is a very broad question. I think it is important. You need always to follow up on the supply chain. And it starts with the preparation of the IMP, the timelines around this, the distribution of the IMP, pharmacy involvement. So it is I think it's a very important aspect, the whole supply chain management.
Okay, thank you. What are the most important points to consider when I, as a small sponsor, want to work with a large vendor?
Yeah, this is an issue which covers a lot of small sponsors because you can always be sure that the vendor is larger than a small sponsor, even if it's a small CRO or a small vendor. And so therefore it is very important to understand each other's organizational structure, the organizational culture, the decision-making processes, and to be very precise on your expectations, also as a small sponsor working with a large CRO, because they have a lot of experience, they have a lot of systems in place, they have a completely different infrastructure and decision-making processes. So this has to be very transparent and open and communicated and to really understand each other. But I'm totally convinced that a small sponsor can very successfully work with a huge CRO, with a large vendor, but it has to be a very open and trustful relationship.
Okay, very good. As KPIs are an important part of vendor management, should KPIs be discussed and agreed upon or included in the contract? What about KQIs?
Yes, I would recommend to include them, the standard KPIs, and KQIs will be part of the quality plan, which should be also part of the contract. Because these are really important agreements you find you have to develop together with a vendor. And you might not have all KPIs at the beginning. Sometimes you will add some more during the conduct of the clinical trial. But the basic and most important one with the highest impact can be part of the contract as well as the KQIs.
Okay, thank you. Someone here is asking, is the recommended type of contract? Is it milestone-based contract or fixed unit contract?
I would always recommend a milestone-based contract because you want to make sure that it is successful deliverables, and therefore you need milestones. If you just pay by the percentage, there's no point to deliver if there is a problem. So I would always recommend milestone payments.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to quickly check. Yeah, I think we've got time just for one more question now. So someone here is just quickly asking, any guidance on audit frequencies?
Yes, at the beginning a qualification audit, and then depending also really on the quality, on your KQIs, what you have implemented and the outcome, you should decide whether you want to go once a year to re-qualify, to do quality audits with a vendor. But you should also consider quality audits with the sites. And these are normally assessed on the quality and data integrity of the sites and of the vendors, how they perform. And so there might be also ad hoc audits needed, but all of these points should go really into the quality management agreement.
Okay, well, very good. I'm afraid that's all the time we're going to have for today, which just leaves a big thanks to today's speakers for a great presentation, and of course to Lumis Life Science Consulting for sponsoring this session. Like I said, we did get a lot of questions in, so apologies if we didn't reach you today, but you may still be contacted later on over email, so keep an eye out for a more in-depth answer there. And I saw a couple of people asking how to get in contact. There is an email address at the bottom of your screen in the blue Contact Us widget. So that may be a good way just to send over an email. Okay, but otherwise, to everyone watching, we'll be sending you over an email shortly, letting you know how to access the on-demand version of this webinar. And you can always get to it through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. Thank you all once again for tuning in, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all participants. It was very enjoyable to have this webinar with you.
Thank you also from my side. Bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon, evening, or morning.